Hello, my name is Lauren Finley, and I'm the president of the Alabama Association for Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. I'm also the director of admissions from Jacksonville State University, and we are very pleased today to have a presentation about breaking down the FAFSA. And that presentation is going to be led by Jessica Wiggins. She is the director of financial aid from Jacksonville State University, and she has been here for the past 3 years with previous experience at the University of West Georgia. So we're very, very happy to have her today. Just a couple of Zoom reminders. Please make sure to keep your videos and your microphones on mute while we are going through the presentation. And if you have any questions, please chat them to us. At the end of the presentation, Ms. Wiggins will be sharing her contact information should you have any follow-up questions. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Wiggins.
Thank you, Lauren. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. And I know that there's probably been a peak in interest with the FAFSA, especially now that it's a high school graduation requirement here in Alabama. So I'm happy to be providing more information and truly breaking down the FAFSA. So what we're going to look at today, just a brief overview of the agenda here. So we are truly going to start with creating an FSA ID and go all the way through the process of the FAFSA to the sign and submit phase. But just as a friendly reminder and note that Federal Student Aid actually has their own YouTube channel. So if you are looking for something to share with your students, or if you are a student and you're looking for information about completing the FAFSA, they have really short, quick informational videos on completing the FAFSA. And most of those also have Spanish subtitles. So the link is there on the screen if you want to go and check out that YouTube channel. They also have a lot of PDF helpful facts and information on their website, studentaid.gov. And a lot of the content from this presentation actually did come from studentaid.gov under the complete aid processes section of that website. And so with that, we will get into the actual presentation. We will get started with creating an FSA ID. So the FSA ID is truly going to be a student and a parent's username and password for submitting the FAFSA every year. So it's very, very important when they create that username and password that they store it in a secure location and that they make sure that they're able to access that each year. Resetting an FSA ID password is not always the simplest thing to do. So we do really encourage people to put that in a secure location so that they don't have to go through the process of resetting it. So as I mentioned, the student and at least one parent will be required to create an FSA ID. This process is typically the longest process in completing the FAFSA, just because we actually, when a student creates their username, they'll put in their social security number and their date of birth, and they will actually be matched. Their social security number will with the Social Security Administration. So sometimes that confirmation process can take up to 24 hours. Social security numbers are required to create an FSA ID. And for an email address, which is a requirement as well, students and parents cannot use the same email address, so it needs to be a separate email address. We also do not recommend that students use their high school email address when they create their FSA ID, because if they ever do forget that password, they will need access to that email address to be able to actually go in and reset. So if they do not maintain access to their high school email after they graduate, then it becomes very difficult for them to actually reset that password. So again, because this is the longest process, we do encourage people to try to create their FSA ID before they get ready to start the FAFSA, so at least a day ahead of time. So again, just a general reminder about storing that in a secure location. So next, what documents will students and parents actually need to complete the FAFSA? So what needs to be gathered before you actually start the process? So we do recommend having this information on hand when you're completing the FAFSA. So obviously you would need the student and the parent's social security number that will be required on the FSA ID, but you'll also confirm that information in the FAFSA itself. An alien registration number if the student or parent is not a U.S. citizen. Of course, their federal tax information or their tax returns, which would include their W-2s. So for the 2022-2023 FAFSA, which is the FAFSA that just opened on October the 1st, parents and students would need their 2020 tax information. And then additionally, if they have any untaxed income, which would be things like any child support received, any interest income that might have accrued, or any type of veterans non-education benefits, any documentation that they have of those amounts from the same tax year. So from 2020, they would need documentation of that as well. So if a student or a parent, they both need that information if they worked and filed taxes in 2020. So it's good to have that on hand when they get started. It will certainly streamline the process. So actually beginning the FAFSA. So students and parents can access the FAFSA online at FAFSA.gov or the studentaid.gov website that I gave at the beginning. Either will direct you entering into the FAFSA. Once they are there and on that web page, there's a very clear button that says start here if they've never started the application process. Now, students and parents can begin and save their progress and then go back into the FAFSA if they need to, if they can't complete it in one session. If the student is the one completing the FAFSA, then they will select I am the student. This is a mistake that parents often make. They think that if they're filling out the FAFSA for their student, that they need to say that they are the student. But this is what often causes the most confusion and where information for the parent and student gets switched inside the FAFSA. There is an option if a parent is a parent completing the FAFSA for a student, there's an option for that. So they would just need to say, I am the parent completing it for my student. This way it is very clear the language that the questions are asking is clear on who it's asking the information for. So that is very important. Once they have selected if they're the student or the parent, they will then enter whichever person's FSA ID. So if it's the student completing the FAFSA and they say, I am the student, they will then enter in the student's FSA ID number. If it is the parent completing it for the student, then the parent will enter in their FSA ID and password. It will then prompt them to create a save key. So I mentioned that you can save your progress and then re-enter into the FAFSA to finish it. That save key is what allows you to do that. So if a student or parent wants to be able to go back in, they need to create that save key. I do recommend making it something easy to remember and writing that down with your FSA ID and password so that you'll be able to remember it. If you don't want to make it very long, you can simply make it something like 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so listing colleges or career schools on the FAFSA. Students can put up to 10 schools on their FAFSA, and we do encourage students to include every school that they are considering applying to. Of course, they can go back even after they've submitted the FAFSA and add or remove schools if they choose to. But many students often don't do that and they see it as a hassle to have to go back in. So we recommend when students are initially completing that FAFSA to go ahead and put in any school that you are interested in applying to. When they're looking for the schools, they don't have to have each school's school code to put them on the FAFSA. There's a very simple search feature within the FAFSA that allows you to search by either college or school name or by city and state. And so then that brings up a list of schools that match that, and then the student confirms or selects which one they are actually wanting to list on their FAFSA. So again, it is encouraged for students to list as many or any schools that they're considering applying to, up to 10 of those. Okay, so now we're getting into the actual questions on the FAFSA. So the actual data that's in the FAFSA, which is typically what we receive the most questions about. So we will start with what determines if a student is dependent or independent. So a student's dependency status is not determined by whether or not a student files taxes or whether they are claimed on someone else's taxes. That actually has no bearing on a student's dependency status. There is actually a series or a list of questions on the FAFSA that are used to determine whether or not a student is dependent or independent. And we'll actually look at those on the next slide. The next slide is a picture from the studentaid.gov website that I mentioned. It's one of their infographics, so you could look at this at any time if you needed to. So this is the infographic. This actually does list every dependency question that's on the FAFSA. So if a student were to answer yes to at least one of the questions on this list, then that would make them an independent student. However, if the answer is no to all questions, then the student is a dependent student. So taking a look at some of these questions, the first question is actually going to be in regards to the student's age. So in order for a student to be old enough to be an independent student, they have to be 24 years of age. And the FAFSA actually provides the date at which the determination is. So what you'll see on the screen is actually the 2021-2022 question on the FAFSA, not the 22-23. But you'll see, will you be 24 or older by January 1st of the school year for which you're applying? And then it gives them an example of that. So if the student says yes to this question, they are independent. If the answer is no, if they have not reached that age, then it goes to the next question. So are you married or separated but not yet divorced? So if a student is married, then they would be considered independent. Some of the other questions, we won't go through each of them individually on the slides. I will highlight just a few that are on the screen. But if the student has children that they financially support, even if they're not married or they are not of age, if they have children, then that would also make them independent. So the next three that I actually want to highlight are listed as numbers 8, 9, and 10 on the list. So you'll see here that some of these are in regards to a student's family status. Number 8 is asking if a student was in foster care at any time since the age of 13. So that would, if the answer to that question is yes, that makes them an independent student. You'll see 9 ask about being an emancipated minor. So that emancipated minor does mean by a court or a legal guardianship, in a legal guardianship as determined by a court. So it actually had to have gone through the legal system. And then number 10 is one that we unfortunately see more and more often, but if the student is an unaccompanied youth who is homeless or at risk of being homeless, so our McKinney-Vento students, they are considered independent, but that McKinney-Vento status is how they would document that. So again, if the answer is yes to any of those questions, then they are independent. So I do want to pause here as we transition to parent information and just talk about the definitions of the difference between dependent and independent. So an independent student, meaning they answered yes to at least one of those questions, they will not be required to report parent information on the FAFSA. So the only information that would be required would be theirs, or if they're married, their spouse's information. That there's no financial information required for the parents if they are independent. However, if they are dependent, then parent information is required on the FAFSA. And with that, we will actually transition into the parents' information that is required for our dependent students. So again, our dependent students it is a requirement that they put in their parent information, which does include financial information. If there are any students if their parents are divorced and they divorced, separated, or never married, and they are uncertain about which parent they need to list on the FAFSA, we actually have a handy infographic on the next slide that we will go over as well. So for biological parents that have divorced and then remarried, so in other words, the student has a step parent, the step parent will be required to be on the FAFSA. So as we look, and I've already just reminded that the 2022-2023 FAFSA is going to ask for 2020 tax information for those parents and or step parents. So I'm going to transition to the infographic, and it's basically a who's my parent on the FAFSA infographic. So this is really, really a helpful flow chart for a student to be able to figure out who do I need to list on the FAFSA. So you'll see the very first question at the beginning of the flow chart is, are my parents married to each other? So if the answer is no, Well, do your parents live together? The answer is no, they do not live together. Then did you live with one of them more than the other in the last 12 months? Odds are the answer is yes. Then you report the information for the parent that you lived with more. If the answer to that question is no, I lived with them both equally, then you report on the FAFSA for the parent who provided the most financial support for you in the last 12-month period. And then you'll see from both of those flows into, has this parent remarried? So whichever one that they choose here, if they have remarried, then that step parent's information is then required on the FAFSA. That is not something that is optional. So if the parent has remarried, they are required to report step parent information on the FAFSA. This infographic also came from the studentaid.gov website and can be accessed at any time. And we can also, if anyone is interested, we can also share these slides afterwards so that people can access the presentation if they would like. And it's also being recorded. Okay, so looking at the financial information that is going to be required on the FAFSA, one of the great tools that has been added to the FAFSA recently in the last 5 to 6 years has been the IRS data retrieval tool. So this tool will actually allow a parent or a student, if they file taxes, to automatically transfer their information, their tax information, from the IRS site directly into the FAFSA. So what that means is it eliminates a lot of the manual entry of tax information from the tax return into the FAFSA. It certainly makes the process a lot easier if they are eligible to use the IRS data retrieval tool. And it is optional, no one is required to use the data retrieval tool, so it will present that as an option on the FAFSA once the student or parent gets to the financial information. So they do have to opt and say, yes, I would like to use the data retrieval tool. It's going to give them a warning message that just simply tells them you are now leaving the FAFSA site and entering into the IRS site. It is just something that they have to do since it is a transition between 2 federal sites. Once they're in the IRS website and they've consented to being in the IRS site, they then have to actually provide their name, their address, and any other information from their tax return exactly as it appeared on the tax return, which is why it is very important that you do have those tax returns on hand, because if everything is in uppercase on your tax return, then you need to enter it in uppercase on the IRS site, because it is truly looking you up to see how you filed your taxes for that given year to be able to transfer that information back in. So it needs to be entered in exactly as it appears on the tax return. So once they've done that, and if the IRS is able to confirm and find their information, then they will actually see a page that tells them their tax information is available, and then again gives them the option to import that information into the FAFSA. So they do have to again consent to importing that into the FAFSA. If they then select that and provide their consent, one way to confirm is that they will actually see a transferred from the IRS on the FAFSA for those data fields then. So for their tax information, they will then see that on the FAFSA form once they transition back into the FAFSA. Once that data is transferred into the FAFSA, it actually cannot be changed because that is how it appeared on their tax return. That information cannot be adjusted. So one issue that we do sometimes see is that a parent or a student views their information and then they don't select to import that information in, and they think that they have transferred their information from the IRS. So they need to make sure that they confirm that they want to import it in, and then actually look for the transferred from the IRS on the FAFSA when they go back into the FAFSA. So if they do not do that, then they will be required to manually input their tax information into the FAFSA. So they would again need their tax return to do that. The data retrieval tool is not available for every person. There is a little bit of a flaw in the system, and specifically for parents or couples who file married filing joint, it can be an issue for them. So that may be that they are required to manually input their information into the FAFSA. So on this slide, this is also another helpful infographic that actually came from studentaid.gov. So it's just breaking down the steps to using the data retrieval tool in case any parents or students get confused when they are trying to import that information in. So it truly just walks you through from logging into the FAFSA all the way to linking to the IRS and seeing the confirmation on that screen. So it's a really helpful tool whenever someone is getting confused on whether or not they did import their information. Okay, so shifting from the financial information that's required to be on the FAFSA to the household information that's required to be on the FAFSA. So students are required to actually put in how many people are in their household. It is key that when students are entering in this information, they fully read the question. So the question is very specific on what it is asking for. It will tell them that they need to be sure to include themselves in the household when they are doing this. So if the student has one sibling and two parents residing in their household size would be a total of 4 because it does include the student. It does include any step parents and step siblings or a step parent. So all of those people need to be listed. If they are residing in the household and they are being provided, their financial support is being provided for by the parents, then they need to be included in the household number. Again, you'll see there just the caveat that if, let's just say that there was a grandparent residing in the household, if the parent is providing at least 50% of the financial support for that grandparent, then they can be included as part of that total household size. So in the example I just gave, so the student has the student, a sibling, two parents, and their grandparent is residing in the household, their total household size would be 5. Another question that it's going to ask in regards to the household size is how many members of the household are actually in and attending college. So they would just have to indicate if their sibling was attending college, then there would be 2 people in the household attending college because the student is going to be attending college and that sibling is either going to be the same year or already is attending college. I do just want to pause here before we get into the signing and submitting part of the FAFSA. There is helpful hints and text throughout the entire FAFSA. There is a blue circle icon with a question mark in it next to every single question on the FAFSA. That provides helpful text and a more in-depth explanation of what the question is asking. So if a student is unsure, they can simply hover or click on that helpful hint and it will provide more information on the question. In addition to that, on the tax information, if someone is required to manually input that information from their tax return into the FAFSA actually tells you exactly what field number on your tax return where you need to get that information from. So it's listed right there in the question. So if you're using an IRS 1040, then it tells you go look at line number 12 for this question, or go look at line number 12 plus line number 14 to get your total and put that in as the answer. So that helpful text is throughout the entire FAFSA if a student is getting stuck on a question. So now we will get to the signing and submitting part of the FAFSA. This is sometimes the holdup with getting a FAFSA fully submitted for students or parents. So both the student and the parent are required to sign the FAFSA. At least one parent, not both, are required to sign, just at least one if they are a dependent student. So they will use their FSA IDs that they have created to sign the FAFSA. If the student has selected that they are the student and they are the one completing the FAFSA, their FSA ID will already be in the FAFSA and they will simply be prompted to sign. And then the parent will then have to go in, put in their FSA ID and just select to sign the FAFSA. They do have to, once they've both signed, they do have to select submit at the very bottom, which is sometimes a holdup as well. They've both signed, but they missed hitting submit at the bottom of the page. So they need to make sure that they do that. Once they have successfully submitted the FAFSA, they will view a confirmation page that says congratulations and the student's name. That is how they can be sure that they have actually fully submitted the FAFSA, is if they see that congratulations page. the email address that the student provided, they will receive a confirmation to that email address that tells them their FAFSA has been submitted, and it will give them an estimate on the amount of time that it will take for their FAFSA to be processed. We do encourage students to check that email address that they use over the next few days once they've submitted, so that they can make sure their FAFSA is processed successfully and that there are no issues with it. One last helpful hint on this is if there is a parent who's completing the FAFSA for more than one student, once they get to this confirmation page when they've submitted the FAFSA, there actually is an option there that says, do you have another student that you need to complete a FAFSA for? And then it can actually transfer most of that parent information in to that other student. That other student would have to have an FSA ID already created, but this information and this option is only presented once they get to the confirmation page. They can never go back and access it after they've reached that confirmation page. And with that, that actually brings us to the end of the presentation. There was a lot of information contained within this presentation, so I thank you for attending or watching if you're watching the recording. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll make sure that my information, my contact is actually in the info session, the information on this session on the website. If there are any questions, I will take them at this time.